At 11 at night, in the back kitchen of a 2-star restaurant in Chicago's River North, the loudest sound wasn't the dishwasher. It was the laughter. Thalia Marinos, 26 years old, 5 years on the prep line, was standing over a steel table with flour up to her elbows when the sous chef leaned in and asked the whole room whether anyone had heard the news. The prep girl thinks she's got a dish good enough for the Sabatini dinner. One cook laughed so hard he had to set his knife down. Another asked if she planned to serve it wrapped in newspaper, the way her mother used to sell it off a folding table on Halsted Street. Thalia didn't argue. She never did. She just said, quietly, without looking up, that she'd never claimed she could make it. She'd said her mother could. That got the biggest laugh of the night. Nobody in that kitchen disliked her because she was difficult. They laughed at her because she was silent, because of the burn scar running up her right forearm that made managers look away during camera checks, because in 5 years, she'd never once been allowed to touch the hotline. 5 years of the same sentence. She's got hands, but this kitchen doesn't sell homemade. What none of them knew was that every night, after the last pan was hung, she stayed behind for half an hour. Not to steal anything, not to pad her hours, just to knead one more batch of dough. The same dough, night after night, for 5 years, from a recipe that had never been written down anywhere in this world. And every single time, it tore. 10 days later, past midnight, a man walked in through that back door without knocking, and every cook who saw his face suddenly found somewhere else to be. In Chicago, people didn't say Emmett Sabatini's name out loud. They just said him. There were 4 menus sitting on his desk from 4 of the finest chefs in the country, and he'd turned down every one of them without explaining why. He stood alone in that kitchen, picked up a torn piece of bread nobody had bothered to throw away, and ate it standing up. And then the most powerful man in the city sat down on a plastic stool beside the vegetable sink, and he didn't move for a long time. When Thalia came back in and found him sitting there, he asked her one question, and that single question would end up costing him more than anything he'd ever paid for in his life. If stories about the people this world overlooks are the kind you want more of, hit that like button. It really does help. Share it with someone who's been underestimated for far too long, and subscribe, because there's another one waiting for you next week. Now let's go back to that kitchen, back to the laughter, and to the woman who just kept kneading anyway. 10 days before that night, Verdun's kitchen was still a place where Thalia Marinos was permitted to stand in only one position. That afternoon, Gideon Thackeray walked the length of the cooking line, with both hands clasped behind his back, the way he'd walked ever since the restaurant earned its 2nd star. He never shouted. People in the profession said that any chef who had to shout had already lost his authority, and Gideon had never lost his. He would simply stop in front of a pan, look down, and quietly say a single sentence, and the person standing there would know what had to be done. The entire kitchen moved according to that voice, a voice that never needed to rise. Thalia waited until he passed the prep table. She'd been waiting all week. On the table sat a small plate she'd covered with a clean cloth that morning, and she'd planned every word she meant to say, keeping them brief, just enough not to inconvenience anyone. She asked whether he might allow her dish to be served at the staff meal that evening, just once, so everyone could taste it. Gideon stopped. He looked at the cloth, not at her. Then he said the sentence everyone in the restaurant knew by heart, that this kitchen didn't tell stories. This kitchen served. And he didn't say it harshly. He said it almost gently, the way someone might remind a child that rain was coming. He told her she was very good at prep work. He told her she washed and cut more neatly than anyone he'd ever hired. Then he added that she should be good where she belonged, and he continued walking without ever lifting the cloth from the plate. No one laughed. That was the worst part. The entire kitchen fell silent in the way people do when they already knew how something would end and saw no reason to discuss it. Nolan Prescott stood at the far end of the cold station, wiping the blade of his knife with a piece of white cloth. He didn't speak immediately. He waited until Gideon's footsteps had faded completely, then called across the room, loudly enough for several people to hear, that people paid for a name in this place, and he asked her what she had that anyone would pay for. Then he glanced at her right forearm, where the sleeve of her chef's coat had been rolled above the elbow because she'd just washed a basin of vegetables, and he asked another question about the thing that was there. Thalia didn't answer. With her left hand, she pulled down her right sleeve, slowly, all the way to her wrist, then fastened the button. She did it with the practiced motion of someone who had done it so many times she no longer needed to look. Nolan remained there watching her for another moment, longer than necessary for a joke he himself had already finished telling. Then he set down the cloth and turned away. The evening passed like every other evening. By the time the last guest had gone, the final pan had been hung on its rack, and the front security shutter had been lowered. The kitchen staff left one by one, their laughter fading through the back door. Thalia stayed behind. She always stayed behind. Half an hour, no more, because the last train home waited for no one. She switched on a single bulb, the one hanging above the vegetable sink, its murky yellow light barely enough to illuminate one steel work table. She took the dough from the refrigerator, the dough she'd prepared that morning and hidden behind a stack of trays no one ever touched. She placed it on the table, which she dusted with a thin layer of flour. Then she did something no one at Verdun had ever seen, because they had all gone home. She laid her palm flat against the dough and held it there for a long while, her head tilted slightly, her eyes fixed somewhere on the brick wall in front of her, as though she were listening to something very soft happening beneath the skin of her hand. Her mother used to do exactly the same thing. She'd said dough knew how to speak too, but it spoke in a language people could hear only when they stood completely still. Thalia began to pull. She stretched it from the center toward both sides, slowly and evenly, her whole body moving with the rhythm of her breathing, her hands traveling in opposite directions across the cold table. The dough spread and grew thinner, thinner until the yellow light began to shine through it, and she could see the shadow of her own hands on the other side. At that point, her heart always beat a little faster, because it was the same every time, just a little farther. Then it tore. A split opened across it, not a large one, directly through the center where the dough was thinnest, and everything she'd managed to stretch collapsed with it like a breath suddenly lost. Thalia straightened. She didn't strike the table with her hand, didn't sigh, didn't say a word. She had passed through that stage a long time ago. She gathered the ruined dough into one corner, picked up the bench scraper, cleaned away every sticky trace, then dusted the steel with a fresh layer of flour and began again from the beginning. Mrs. Connie Whitlow, over in the dishwashing area, heard the scraper moving across the steel and didn't look over. Outside, the street had gone quiet. Inside the kitchen, there was only the sound of two hands moving over dough, and a 26-year-old woman trying once more to remake something she had failed at so many times that she'd stopped counting. The way she laid her palm over the dough wasn't something she had invented herself. Someone had taught her, and that person had taught her with her own two hands. When Thalia was a little girl, she was awakened every Saturday morning before the sky had fully brightened, and her mother, Despina Marinos, had already been standing in the kitchen for a long time. They walked out to Halsted Street, while their breath still turned to smoke in the cold, carrying a folding iron table that Despina tucked beneath one arm, the way someone might carry a musical instrument, and a wooden box with a handle. She set the table up in the same place every time, never anywhere else, close against the brick wall of a shoe repair shop that had closed down. Everyone who came to the Saturday morning market in that neighborhood knew that table. Men on their way to early shifts would stop to buy one, eating it while standing on the sidewalk, and Despina always gave them an extra sheet of paper so they wouldn't burn their hands. She couldn't speak much English, and writing it was even further beyond her reach. Once, Thalia asked why her mother didn't write the recipe down so she wouldn't forget it. Despina laughed and said she couldn't forget, because it wasn't kept inside her head. She said it was kept here, and then she raised both hands. So she taught her daughter in the only way she knew. She pulled a small stool close to the table, placed the child on it so she could reach, then stood behind her, slipped both arms past either side of her shoulders, and laid her own hands over her daughter's. Then she pulled. Thalia had only to let her hands follow. Her mother explained nothing. She didn't tell her to pull harder or more gently, didn't count a rhythm, didn't measure. She simply let the small hands rest beneath the larger ones, and they repeated the motion over and over, Saturday morning after Saturday morning, until the child's hands knew the path on their own, though her mind couldn't have remembered a single word. At the final stage, once the dough had been rolled and placed on the tray, her mother always took the tip of a knife and scored 3 lines across the top. 3 lines, never 2, never 4, always 3, and always spaced so evenly that it seemed she must have measured them. Once, Thalia asked what the 3 lines were for. Despina stopped, looked down at the loaf for a moment, then smiled and said they were there so it could breathe. The little girl nodded, and she believed that answer for many years afterward, because she wasn't yet old enough to understand that some answers were given only to avoid giving the true one. Then, her mother died. It happened when Thalia was still very young enough to believe she would someday finish learning all the things there hadn't been time to teach her. Despina left her daughter with a little brother named Nico, and an old oven with a loose handle that no one had bothered to tighten in years, because every time someone tightened it, it came loose again within a few days, and everyone had grown so accustomed to it that they knew to lift it slightly before pulling the door open. That handle became the thing Thalia touched more often than anything else in her life. Now the two of them lived in an apartment above a laundromat, where the floor was always a few degrees warmer than the air outside because the dryers ran constantly beneath them. And during winter, that was the only thing worth feeling grateful for. Thalia worked 2 shifts a day. The morning shift was at a diner near the train station. The evening shift was at Verdun, and the hours between them were the time she used to go home, change her clothes, cook something hot for Nico, and leave again. That night, she came home later than usual, because she had stayed behind in the kitchen for half an hour with the torn dough. The light in the front room was still on. Nico hadn't gone to sleep. He was sitting on the floor with a box of colored pencils and several unfinished drawings, and when he heard the door open, he looked up. He looked at his sister's hands first, the way he always did, then raised his own hands and asked whether there was any bread today. Thalia set down her bag. She could still smell the flour on her sleeves. She sat on the floor so they were at the same height, then signed back that there would be bread tomorrow. Nico wrinkled his nose, pretending to think about it very seriously, then signed again, asking whether tomorrow meant for certain, and tapped 2 fingers lightly against the floor, the way someone might press a seal onto a document. Thalia laughed. She raised her hands and answered that it was certain. The boy smiled back, a smile so wide it reached almost to his ears, then returned to his colored pencils. She stayed there for a while longer, watching him draw, both hands resting on her knees, and she didn't think about the tear in the dough anymore. The next morning, between her 2 shifts, Thalia didn't go home. She went to a small clinic on the 2nd floor of an old building, where she had postponed this appointment 3 times, each time with a reason that sounded perfectly sensible. She sat in a plastic chair in the hallway, her left hand resting over her right, and remained that way until someone called her name. The doctor was an older man who spoke quickly, and without circling around the point, the kind of person who had sat behind that desk long enough to understand that avoiding the truth only made people more afraid. He told her to place her hand on the table, then asked her to close it, open it, turn her wrist, and press her thumb into her palm. He asked whether she felt numbness at night. She said she did. He asked which fingers went numb. She told him. He asked what she did for a living, and when she said she worked in a kitchen, he didn't ask anything else. He only nodded, as though he had just heard the final sentence of a story whose ending he had guessed from the beginning. Then he spoke plainly. He said the tendons and nerves passing through her right wrist had become severely compressed after years of constant work with her hands, and the old scar tissue on her forearm was tightening over time, pulling everything beneath it toward a place where it didn't belong. Those 2 things together had created her present condition. He said she needed surgery. He said that if she had it soon, a good recovery was almost certain, but if she waited too long, she would gradually lose sensation in her fingertips, and he placed his emphasis on the word fingertips, not on anything else. Thalia said nothing. He thought she hadn't understood, so he explained that she would still be able to grip things, still be able to cook, still be able to live a normal life. It was only the fine sensation, the part that knew whether something was hot or cold, soft or taut, thick or thin. That part would begin to fade. Thalia said she understood. She understood more clearly than he imagined. A baker could lose strength, lose a job, lose every other thing, and still keep working. But the part that knew how thin the dough had become, whether it was ready, whether it could be stretched any farther, that part didn't live in the eyes, and didn't live in the mind. It lived where 10 fingertips touched the surface of the dough. That was the only thing her mother had passed down to her. And it was also the one thing no one could pass down through words. The doctor wrote the surgical order, signed his name, and sent her to the desk beside his to ask about insurance. The woman sitting there typed several lines, studied the screen for a moment, then told her the amount the insurance would cover and the amount Thalia would have to pay herself. She said it gently, in the voice of someone who had been forced to say the same thing many times that day. Thalia thanked her, folded the paper, and went down the stairs. That afternoon, when she returned home to change her clothes, she took an envelope from the children's hospital out of the mailbox, the one she had been waiting for all those weeks. Inside was the appointment schedule for Nico's procedure, and a notice stating how much had to be paid before the admission process could begin. She stood in the middle of the room and read both sides of the paper. In the drawer beneath the kitchen sink, under a layer of cleaning cloths, there was a brown paper envelope into which she had been putting money for more than 2 years, a little each week, whatever remained after the rent, electricity, and everything else had been paid. She took it out, emptied it onto the table, and counted. She counted twice to make certain, though she had known after the first count it was enough for one of the two things. It wasn't enough for both. Thalia sat down in the chair. She didn't deliberate for long. In truth, she didn't deliberate at all, because there are calculations people finish long before they ever reach the moment when the answer is required, from the day they are left with a little brother and an oven with a loose handle. She picked up her own surgical order, folded it in half, then folded it into quarters, opened the drawer, and placed it at the very bottom, beneath even the old bills, where it couldn't be seen when the drawer was opened. She closed the drawer. Then she stood, washed her hands, and went to work the evening shift. About 30 minutes away by car, on the top floor of a building with no nameplate outside its door, there was a room where no one sat with his back to the entrance. It wasn't a rule, no one had ever written it down, and no one had ever spoken it aloud, but everyone who stepped into that room found himself a chair with a clear view of the doorway, and they did it so quickly that they never even noticed themselves doing it. Emmett Sabatini was 33 years old. He sat at the head of the table, in the only place in the room with a direct view of both the main door and the side entrance, and he was the only man there who could sit perfectly still without needing to look at anyone. On the table before him lay 4 stiff covered folders, 4 menus. Verdun had won the contract for the dinner, and Gideon Thackeray had done exactly what a 2-star chef did after securing the largest commission of his life. He had called the most distinguished friends he knew, 4 names from 4 corners of the country. One had received his 3rd star the previous season. Another had 2 restaurants in New York where anyone hoping for a reservation had to wait until the following year. Bruno Cavallo stood to Emmett's right and read through each proposal in turn, his voice even as he moved from one dish to the next, naming even the regions from which every ingredient would be brought. When he finished the first folder, Bruno looked up. Emmett shook his head. Bruno read the second. Emmett shook his head. By the third, he didn't even wait for Bruno to finish. When they reached the 4th, Bruno read more slowly, and by the time he stopped, several men in the room were looking toward the head of the table. Emmett shook his head one final time, offered not a single word of explanation, then pushed all 4 folders toward the center of the table with the tips of 2 fingers. Bruno was the only person in the room who dared to ask. He had walked beside Emmett since the years when neither of them had yet been called sir, and he asked why. Emmett was silent for a moment. Then he said that all 4 were perfect. He said there wasn't a single flaw in any of them, not one place where he could point and say that something was wrong. Then he said the problem was that the moment he swallowed the food, he forgot it, and he had eaten at all 4 of those restaurants, yet couldn't remember a single dish from any of them, though he could remember perfectly well whether it had rained that day. A quiet laugh came from the far end of the table. Then another. Several men in the room began to laugh. The laughter of men accustomed to laughing at precisely the moment laughter was expected, because they believed he had made a joke about expensive chefs. Only one person didn't laugh. Ignazio Sabatini sat 3 places down from the head of the table, his old hands folded one over the other on the wood, and the corner of his mouth didn't move once. He said it was the same for him, and had been for many years. Then he rose and left the room. The door closed behind him, and the laughter died completely. Bruno waited a beat before returning the conversation to where it belonged. He reminded them that the dinner was exactly 10 days away. No one in the room needed those 10 days explained any further. That dinner wasn't merely a dinner. The 4 branches of the family would sit at one table, something they hadn't done in a very long time, and at the end of the evening, papers would be brought out for signatures. Emmett was moving all of the family's business into the light, into enterprises with licenses and ledgers, into things their children and grandchildren might one day name during a job interview without lowering their eyes. He had spent years preparing for it, but the decision wasn't his alone to make. 4 branches, 4 signatures, and if even one was missing, everything would stop exactly where it stood. The man who opposed it most fiercely was Ignazio, his uncle, who had been sitting in rooms like this one since before Emmett was born. Ignacio said what they were doing wasn't stepping aside. It was running away. He said a name stood upon the same thing from which it had been built, and a man couldn't replace the foundation of a house while he was still living inside it. Bruno asked whether Emmett wanted to choose another restaurant, asking very carefully, because changing restaurants now meant 10 days and a completely unfamiliar kitchen. Emmett said no. Then he stood, picked up his coat, and said he would go see the kitchen himself. Bruno asked when, and Emmett said tonight. Bruno looked at the clock, then looked back at him, and didn't ask another question. That night at Verdun, the dough tore again, and Thalia gathered the ruined part into one corner of the table as she always did. She meant to throw it away, but one piece along the outer edge was still intact, the part she hadn't stretched yet, and she couldn't bear to waste it. So she baked it in the small oven in the corner of the kitchen, the one they used to warm bread for the staff. The piece came out misshapen, thick in some places and thin in others, resembling nothing at all. She broke off a piece, tasted it, and left the rest on a paper plate. Mrs. Connie Whitlow came out from the dishwashing area, her hands still tangled in a faded plastic apron. She was the oldest person in the restaurant, and the one who spoke the least. In the 5 years Thalia had worked there, the two of them had exchanged no more than 10 sentences, most of them about where the dirty trays belonged. Connie walked past the paper plate, stopped, and asked whether it was edible. Thalia said, "Yes, ma'am. Please help yourself." Connie picked up a piece. She didn't bite into it immediately. She held it near her nose first, then took a bite, and she chewed very slowly. So slowly that Thalia began to feel self-conscious. Then she swallowed and stood perfectly still. She remained still long enough for the hum of the kitchen's cooling system to become the loudest sound in the room. She didn't look at Thalia. She looked down at the paper plate, then toward the brick wall behind the sink, and when she spoke, her voice was nothing like the one she used when asking where the dirty trays belonged. She asked which corner of Halsted Street her mother had sold from. Thalia straightened. She had never told anyone in this restaurant that her mother had sold food on Halsted Street. Nolan and the others knew because they had heard it somewhere, and they used it as a joke, but they had never asked which corner. No one had ever asked which corner, because no one cared where a folding table had once stood on a street that no longer existed in the same way. She said it had been beside the wall of a shoe repair shop, near the intersection. Connie nodded slowly. Then she said she had eaten this bread before. She said it had been a very long time ago, so long that she had believed she had forgotten it completely. Yet the moment the bread touched her tongue, she remembered at once, even how cold that morning had been. Thalia stepped closer. Connie continued, and this was the sentence Thalia would hear over and over in her mind for many nights afterward. She said it hadn't torn back then. Then she added, still without looking at her, that back then it hadn't been made by one person. Thalia asked what she meant. Connie didn't answer. She asked again, more urgently this time, asking whether Connie had seen her mother make it, where she had seen her, and when. Connie placed the remaining bread back on the paper plate and wiped her hands on the apron. She said there were things she hadn't exactly hidden, only things she hadn't known would do any good if spoken aloud. Thalia said she had been making this bread for 5 years, every night, and every night it tore, and she didn't know what she was doing wrong. She said it louder than she intended, and she heard her voice break on the final word. Only then did Connie look at her. For the first time in 5 years, she looked directly into Thalia's face. Then she asked how many more years Thalia intended to keep it in the freezer. She said keeping it there wouldn't bring it back to life. Thalia couldn't answer. Connie turned away, pulled the plastic apron over her head, and before disappearing behind the rows of stainless steel racks, she added one final sentence, her voice ordinary again. She told Thalia not to throw away the ruined dough tonight, to leave it where it was, and look at it again in daylight tomorrow, because she might see something then that she couldn't see at night. Then she left. Thalia remained alone beside the steel table, flour still clinging to both hands, and she couldn't remember how long she stood there. At the doorway leading into the storage corridor, the door stood open by a narrow crack. Nolan Prescott was there. He had been standing there since Connie took the first bite, and he had heard everything. He didn't laugh. He didn't say a word. He only eased the door shut so softly that Thalia never heard it, then walked down the dark corridor toward the back exit with both hands in his pockets. And along the way, he didn't turn on a single light. "Who taught you to make this?" That was the question, and Thalia stood in the middle of the aisle with flour still clinging to both hands, unsure whether she should step forward or move back. she said her mother had taught her. The man sitting in the plastic chair didn't ask another question right away. He looked at the piece of bread in his hand, turned it slightly, then asked whether her mother still made it. Thalia said her mother had died. He nodded, barely at all, the way someone nods after hearing something he had already guessed before asking. Then he asked what the dish was called. She said Saturday bread. He set the piece down. He lowered it so slowly that Thalia could follow the entire path of his hand from the height of his chest to the steel table, and she couldn't understand how something so simple could take so long. He said nothing else for a long while. The only sounds in the kitchen were the hum of the cooling system and water dripping from the faucet beside them, the one no one had bothered to call someone to repair in years. Thalia asked who he was. She asked in an ordinary voice, without fear, because at that moment she truly had no idea who stood before her. And later, when she thought back on it, she would believe that ignorance had been the greatest mercy of the entire evening. The man didn't answer. He studied her for a moment, looking first at her hands and only then at her face, and asked whether she would make it again tomorrow. Thalia said yes. She said she made it every night. He asked what time. She said after everyone had gone home, around 11 o'clock. He rose. He adjusted the collar of his coat and said thank you. Nothing more. Then he left through the back door, which closed very softly behind him, and Thalia could still hear a car starting at the far end of the alley before it drove away. She remained alone in the kitchen, and only then did she realize that the bread on the steel table was gone, leaving nothing but a few small crumbs on the paper plate. She cleaned the table, switched off the bulb above the vegetable sink, and took the last train home. The next morning, she arrived at Verdun earlier than usual. She pushed open the side door and stepped inside, and the instant she crossed the threshold, the entire kitchen went silent. It didn't gradually quiet down. It stopped at once. Someone speaking in the middle of a sentence cut himself off halfway through. Two people standing at the cold station turned toward her together, then looked away just as quickly. Someone else was lifting the lid from a plastic container and held it suspended in midair without lowering it. Thalia walked down the aisle between the two cooking lines, and she could hear the soles of her own shoes against the tile, a sound she hadn't heard once in 5 years, because it had always been drowned beneath the clatter of pans and voices. She reached her prep station, set down her bag, and tied on her apron. No one said a word to her. No one teased her. No one asked a question, and no one told her to fetch a basin of vegetables. All that morning, only one person looked directly into her face. It was Connie in the dishwashing area, and even she said nothing, only gave Thalia one brief look before lowering her eyes to the stack of plates in front of her. It wasn't until nearly noon that Thalia understood. She caught fragments of two people talking in the corner of the storeroom. They spoke about a car that had been parked in the back alley the night before. They spoke about the night security guard seeing someone come out through the rear door. Then one of them said a name. The other told him not to say that name so loudly. Thalia stood motionless beside the basin of vegetables, both hands still submerged in the cold water, and she understood that the night before, she had asked a man who he was, while everyone in this kitchen had already known the answer before she even made it home. That afternoon, the car appeared in the rear alley again, but this time daylight still filled the sky, and everyone in the kitchen saw it. Emmett Sabatini entered through the front door with Bruno Cavallo beside him, and he didn't stop in the dining room. He went straight down to the kitchen. People say there are places where the air changes the moment a certain man enters, before anyone has even had time to look toward the door, and Verdun's kitchen was such a place that afternoon. A young kitchen assistant carrying a tray pressed himself flat against the wall, though the passage was still wide enough. Gideon Thackeray wiped his hands on a towel, stepped forward to greet them, and spoke in the most courteous voice he possessed. Emmett didn't circle around the point. He said the first appetizer at the dinner would be the bread made by the young woman at the prep table. He said it in the same tone someone might use to announce a train's departure time, without raising his voice even half a note, and he offered no explanation. Gideon stood frozen for a beat. Then he laughed, the laugh of a man who believed he must have heard incorrectly, and said there had surely been some misunderstanding. Emmett didn't respond. Gideon turned and looked across the kitchen as though searching for an ally. Then he began to speak, and this time his voice was loud. He said he had built this kitchen with his entire life. He said he had 4 menus on his table, 4 names that would make anyone in the profession stand a little straighter upon hearing them, and he asked whether he was now expected to serve 40 guests, a piece of bread made by someone who had never even been permitted to work the hotline. He said there were rules in this kitchen. He said not everything belonged on a dining table simply because someone happened to like it. The entire kitchen was silent. Thalia stood at the prep table with a paring knife still in her hand, and she didn't dare set it down because she was afraid of the sound it would make against the steel. Emmett waited until Gideon had finished. He didn't interrupt him once. Then, when Gideon stopped to breathe, Emmett repeated exactly what he had said before, without adding or removing a single word. The first appetizer at the dinner would be the bread made by the young woman at the prep table. His voice still didn't rise. Bruno Cavallo stood behind him with his hands folded in front of his stomach, his eyes lowered to the floor. Gideon opened his mouth to continue, then said nothing. The silence lasted so long that they could hear water boiling in a pot at the far end of the kitchen. Then Emmett turned toward Thalia and asked whether she had any ready. She said there was a batch she had baked that morning. He told her to bring it out. Thalia went to get it. She placed the plate on the steel table in the middle of the kitchen, where everyone could see it, then stepped back. Emmett didn't touch it. He looked at Gideon. Nothing more needed to be said. Gideon Thackeray, a chef with 2 stars, the man who less than a day earlier had walked past her cloth-covered plate, without even bothering to lift the cloth, now stood before his entire kitchen knowing he had no other choice. He stepped forward. He broke off a small piece, in the deliberate manner of a man who wanted everyone to understand that he was doing this only to get it over with. He raised it to his mouth. He chewed. Then he stopped chewing. He remained still longer than such a small piece of bread required, and during that time he looked at no one, his eyes fixed on a point on the steel table before him. The entire kitchen waited. Gideon swallowed. Then he said, in a flat and cold voice, that the structure had failed. He said the dough couldn't hold, that this couldn't be served. Emmett showed no reaction. He only watched. And then, before anyone had time to move, Gideon Thackeray's right hand rose, broke a second piece from the plate, and carried it to his mouth. Everyone in the kitchen saw it. The next morning, Thalia was moved into the main kitchen. No one greeted her. No one congratulated her. Gideon Thackeray pointed toward the far end of the line, where the smallest steel table in the entire kitchen stood against the wall, a place where empty plastic containers had always been stacked temporarily, and he told her she would work there. The containers were cleared away. Her table was so narrow that when she stretched the dough, she had to keep both elbows drawn close to her body, and she spent the entire day with her back turned to the rest of the kitchen. She didn't complain. She had been standing with her back to that kitchen for 5 years already. Before, she had simply been doing it from another place. The dough still tore. On the first night he came, the clock on the wall had already passed 11 o'clock, and everyone else had gone home. Emmett Sabatini entered through the back door alone, without Bruno beside him. He said nothing. He simply pulled out the plastic chair near the vegetable sink and sat down, and Thalia noticed that he chose that chair, even though several others in the kitchen were taller and cleaner. She stretched the dough. He sat and watched. When she reached the thinnest part, it tore, and she heard herself release a very quiet breath. He didn't say anything until she had finished scraping the table clean. Then he stood, tasted a small piece from the edge, and said, "Close, but not yet." Then he left. On the second night, he said exactly the same thing. On the third, the fourth, and every night after that, he continued to come, continued to sit in that same chair, and continued to speak those same 4 words before leaving, until Thalia began to wait for them, the way people waited for the final church bell of the day. They hardly spoke. He didn't ask where she lived, how old she was, or why someone with hands like hers had spent 5 years at a prep table. She didn't ask what he did for a living either, though by then she knew enough to understand why the entire kitchen had fallen silent the day he walked in. The silence between them wasn't the silence of discomfort. It was more like the silence shared by 2 people waiting for the same train, both knowing it would come and knowing there was nothing that needed to be said while they waited. But there was one different night. It was raining, and he arrived later than usual. One shoulder of his coat darkened with water. He sat in the plastic chair, and this time he spoke before she had a chance to begin. He asked whether she had ever cooked something for someone who was dead. Thalia said she was doing exactly that every night. He nodded. Then he told her about his grandmother. He said she had come to this country when she was very young, with no one waiting for her, and without knowing a single word of English, and she had worked in other people's kitchens throughout the years that no one in the family later wanted to speak about. He said the skin on her hands had grown so calloused that she could lift the handle of a pot straight from the fire without using a cloth. And when he was a boy, he had believed it was a miracle. Only much later did he understand that it was simply what many years of hard labor had done to her. He said she died before he had managed to buy her anything truly worthwhile. Then he added, in a voice as light as though he were speaking about the weather, that she had been a terrible cook. He offered no further explanation, and Thalia didn't ask for one. He sat quietly for a while, watching the faucet drip in the corner of the kitchen. Then he said he could buy almost anything he wanted. He said he could buy the entire restaurant before the coffee in his hand had time to cool. Then he said the only thing he truly wanted had been sold by someone who had died long ago, and there was no one left in the world who would take his money for it. Thalia didn't answer. She lowered her head, placed her palm over the dough, and began to stretch it. That night, it tore again. Before he left, he still said, "Close, but not yet." Then there came an afternoon when everything almost worked. Thalia began while the kitchen was still empty, moving more slowly than usual, and when she reached the thinnest part of the dough, it didn't tear. It stretched a little farther, becoming so thin that the overhead light shone clearly through it. Then it stopped there and held. She stood perfectly still, afraid even to breathe too deeply. It tore only at the edge, a tiny split in a place that could be trimmed away without anyone ever knowing. She rolled it, placed it in the oven, and while she waited, she washed her hands 3 times, because she didn't know what else to do with them. The tray came out of the oven when the kitchen was at its busiest, and the smell reached everyone before the tray did. One person looked up, then another. Thalia set it down on the steel table in the center of the kitchen, and this time she didn't have to invite anyone. They came over on their own. The entire kitchen gathered around that tray and ate in silence, a silence completely different from the one that had fallen when Emmett walked in. No one said it was good. No one said it was bad. They simply ate, and one person reached for another piece, and the person beside him reached out too. Gideon Thackeray came last. He tasted it, set down what remained in his hand, then returned to his small office without saying a word. About 15 minutes later, he came back out carrying a printed copy of the dinner menu, and he pinned it to the board at the head of the kitchen. Beneath the name of the first appetizer was her name. No one applauded, but no one passed that board without stopping to read it. That evening, after the kitchen had quieted, Thalia made a second batch for Emmett to taste the next day. She wanted it to be exactly like the one from that afternoon, the same in every detail. She dusted the steel with flour, set down the dough, placed her palm over it, and held it still the way her mother always had. Then she began to stretch. Somewhere near the middle, something happened that she didn't understand at first. Her right hand was moving across the dough, and she could see it moving, but she could no longer feel the dough. It wasn't pain. It wasn't the sharp sting of numbness. It was simply that the part of her that had always told her how tightly the dough was drawn, whether it could stretch any farther, had gone silent, like someone leaving the room in the middle of a sentence. She stopped. She pressed her thumb against the tips of her other fingers and felt nothing. She touched the edge of the steel table, the cold edge she had touched thousands of times, and it wasn't cold. Thalia straightened, released a breath, then bent down and continued, because she didn't know what else to do. She pulled, and because she couldn't feel it, she didn't know how much force she was using. Her left hand followed one path, her right another, and the two sides no longer moved together. The dough tore, but it didn't tear across the middle as it always had. It split along a long diagonal line from one edge to the other, ripping through even the part that had never failed before, a kind of tear she had never seen in all 5 years. She stood staring at it for a very long time. At the far end of the kitchen, 2 assistants were cleaning up and talking about something, and one of them called over to ask whether she was still working, asking in an ordinary voice, the voice of someone who now considered her part of the kitchen. Thalia said she still had a little work to finish. Then she lowered her right hand beneath the table and kept it there, hidden behind the steel, and she remained that way until the 2 men hung up their aprons, switched off the lights along the outer row, and disappeared through the back door. Thalia's name had been on the board at the head of the kitchen for 2 days when Nolan Prescott sat down at the computer in his apartment near dawn. He had prepared everything in advance. Inside a folder was a file he had spent the entire week assembling, and it wasn't long, only a few pages, but every line had been chosen carefully. No professional qualification, no formal culinary training of any kind. Left school years ago without finishing. had never worked the hotline anywhere, at any time, including the restaurant that currently employed her. He wrote those lines in the dry language of someone preparing a personnel record, without a single adjective, because he knew adjectives made readers suspicious, while bare facts did not. Then he inserted the photograph at the end. It was a picture he had taken secretly one night from behind, and slightly to one side, the lens capturing Thalia's right forearm at the moment she rolled up her sleeve to wash her hands, the scar clearly visible beneath the bulb hanging above the vegetable sink. Behind her, on the steel table in the hidden corner, sat a tray of dough covered with a damp cloth. It had risen and begun to spill over the edge, something any baker would have recognized at a glance as the second stage of proofing. He didn't notice the tray. He was too busy deciding how to write the caption, and in the end, he added one brief sentence, asking whether the person directly responsible for preparing the first course for 40 guests met the hygiene standards of an open kitchen. He sent it to 2 places. One copy went to the offices of a culinary magazine where he knew an editor. The other went to Ignazio Sabatini's business address, which had taken him 2 days to obtain. Then he closed the computer and sat motionless in the darkness for a long time, telling himself that he was protecting the kitchen, protecting the 2 stars into which so many people had poured their entire lives, that if the truth came out after the dinner, everyone in that kitchen would lose their jobs, not only her. He repeated it to himself again and again until morning, and by morning, he had almost come to believe it. That afternoon, Ignazio summoned Emmett. He placed the file on the table, turned it so it faced the proper direction, and for the first few seconds, he didn't need to say anything. Then he said the 4 branches would be sitting at that table, and the food placed before them would have been prepared by someone whose records were already in the hands of the press. He told Emmett to cancel it. He said there was still time. There might no longer be 10 days, but there were still several days, enough to choose one of the other 4 menus and bring the matter to an end. Emmett looked at the file. He didn't open it. Then he asked whether his uncle had tasted the bread. Ignazio said that wasn't relevant. Emmett said that to him, it was the only thing that was relevant. The 2 men looked at each other across the wooden table. Ignazio pushed the file toward him and said that sooner or later, Emmett would have to choose between what he liked and what this family needed. And Emmett picked up the file, folded it in half, then left the room without answering. When he reached the car, he made a call. It was brief, less than half a minute, and Bruno Cavallo, sitting in the front seat, couldn't hear anything Emmett said except the final few words. Then Emmett ended the call and looked out through the window. No one ever spoke to anyone about what happened afterward. The next morning, a restaurant on the north side of the city, where Nolan Prescott had been scheduled to meet the following week to discuss taking over as head chef, called to postpone the appointment indefinitely. By afternoon, another establishment, where he had submitted an application the previous season and had been awaiting a response, sent him a courteous letter informing him that the position had been filled. The next day, his editor friend at the magazine didn't answer the phone, and by evening, sent a single message saying the article wouldn't run. By the end of the second day, Nolan called an acquaintance in the profession, someone with whom he had shared dinner less than a month earlier, and the man answered, exchanged exactly 2 meaningless sentences, then said he was busy and would call back. No one called back. No one explained anything to him. There was no threatening call. No one came to see him, and not a single word appeared in writing anywhere. It was simply that every door he had believed was open began closing one after another, very quietly, almost politely, and Nolan Prescott stood in the middle of that corridor without understanding what he had touched. The article never ran, but the file had already left the kitchen, and there was no bringing it back. By the 3rd morning, 3 different places had called Gideon Thackeray to make polite inquiries in the tone people used when they wanted to learn one thing while pretending to ask about another. He remained in his small office for most of the morning. Then he called Thalia in. He didn't invite her to sit because there was only one chair in the room, and he was sitting in it. He said he was very sorry. He said the kitchen didn't belong to him alone, that nearly 40 people depended on it for their living, and he had no right to risk all 40 of them for something he personally believed was right. He said he had told everyone she was leaving for personal reasons. Thalia asked whether he remembered the day he ate the second piece. Gideon lowered his eyes to the desk. He said he remembered. Then he said nothing more, and she didn't ask anything else. She removed her apron, folded it, placed it on the corner of his desk, and walked out. No one in the kitchen looked up. That afternoon, when she arrived home, she found a voice message from the hospital. They told her Nico's appointment would have to be postponed until the next quarter, that the advance payment was due by the end of the week and had not yet appeared in the account, and the speaker's voice remained gentle, remained courteous, remained the voice of someone who had to say the same thing many times each day. Thalia listened to the entire message, then played it again. She stood in the middle of the kitchen for a while. Then she picked up her phone and called a company that bought used kitchen equipment, a number she had saved a very long time ago but had never once dialed. They arranged to come the following morning. Early the next day, she took Nico to the downstairs neighbor's apartment and told him she had to repair something in the kitchen, that there would be a great deal of dust, and that he should stay there and play until the afternoon. The boy carried his box of colored pencils and a stack of paper, and he signed to ask whether he could come home early that afternoon. She said he could. The two men arrived near noon. They disconnected the pipe, laid a board across the steps, and carried her mother's old oven away from the wall where it had stood for so many years. In the place it had left behind, the tile floor showed a clean square, much brighter than everything around it. Thalia stepped aside to let them pass. She watched the oven disappear beyond the first landing. Then she called down in an ordinary voice, telling them to be careful with the handle because it was loose. One of the men answered that they would. She stood at the top of the stairs and listened as they carried it down all 3 floors. Listened to the vehicle door close. Listened to the engine start and fade away. She didn't cry. She went back inside and swept the neat square of floor, though it had already been clean. Nico returned that afternoon. He stepped inside, placed his box of colored pencils on the table, then stopped and stared at the wall. He looked at it for a long time. Then he turned toward her, raised his hands, and asked what had happened there. Thalia sat down so they were at the same height and signed that someone had borrowed it for a while. Nico nodded. He didn't ask who had borrowed it or how long they would keep it. He simply went to the table, pulled out a blank sheet of paper, sat down on the floor, and began to draw. He worked for a long time, occasionally looking up at the wall as though he were taking measurements. When he finished, he took some tape, pulled over a chair, climbed onto it, and fastened the paper directly in the center of the empty space. It was a drawing of an oven in brown-colored pencil, with 4 legs, a door left slightly open, and a handle on the side that he had shaded much darker than everything else. He climbed down from the chair, turned to look at his sister, then raised his hands and asked whether it was all right now. Thalia looked at the wall, then at him. She laughed. Then she signed that it was, and that it looked better than the old one. Nico burst into laughter, a soundless laugh that shook both his shoulders, and he ran to get more paper so he could keep drawing. That night, at the end of the street where the laundromat stood, a black car pulled close to the curb and switched off its lights. Emmett Sabatini sat in the back seat. He didn't get out. He looked up at the illuminated window on the 3rd floor until the light went dark, then told the driver to go. The box had been lying beneath the oven all those years. When the 2 men laid down the board and tilted the oven away from the wall, it slid out with it. A square tin box rusted at all 4 corners, the kind of cookie tin people often kept to hold something else. Thalia had pushed it into a corner of the kitchen while cleaning, and forgotten all about it until that evening, after Nico had fallen asleep, and the only sound in the apartment was the dryers running on the ground floor below. She sat down on the floor and opened the lid. Inside were the things she had expected to find. Several jar lids, a spool of thread, a wooden spoon worn flat along one side, a photograph taken at a church, yellowed at the corners, and lying flat at the very bottom was an envelope. It was larger than an ordinary envelope, made of thick ivory paper, and in the upper left corner, embossed into the surface, was the name of a law office. Beneath it, printed in smaller but perfectly clear letters, was the name Sabatini. Thalia turned it over. The sealed edge was still intact. There wasn't a single tear, not one sign that anyone had opened it, slipped something through the seam, or resealed it afterward. The envelope had never been opened. She sat motionless for a long time with it resting across her knees. Then she looked at the postmark stamped in the corner, and she had to tilt it toward the light before she could read the date, faded by time. She knew that date. She knew it very well, because it was only a few days after the morning her mother had gone out to Halsted Street and returned home empty-handed, without the folding table, then sat on the edge of the bed without taking off her coat. Thalia took the paring knife from the drawer and cut along the top edge. Inside were 2 sheets of paper. The first was a letter from the law office, written in the dry language of people accustomed to sending letters to strangers. It stated that, according to the wishes of Mrs. Assunta Sabatini, which she had expressed in the presence of 2 witnesses before her death, the office was responsible for arranging a guarantee of commercial rent in the name of Mrs. Despina Marinos at the address on Halsted Street, valid for a period of several years and eligible for renewal. They asked Mrs. Marinos to contact the telephone number listed below to complete the necessary paperwork. The second sheet was the guarantee agreement, already signed, already stamped, lacking only one signature on the final line at the lower right. That space was still blank. Thalia read both pages to the end. Then she began again from the top. Understanding came to her very slowly, one piece at a time, the way a person understands something. Her mind is doing everything it can not to understand. Her mother had held this envelope in her hands. She had seen the embossed name in the upper left corner. That name, that exact name, had appeared only days earlier on the notice pasted to the door of the building across the street, the notice saying that no one would be permitted to sell there anymore. She couldn't read well enough to understand everything inside, but she could read that family name, and she had carried the envelope home, placed it inside the tin box, pushed the box beneath the oven, then gone out to find other work. She had never opened it, not once, before the day she died. Thalia laid the 2 sheets of paper on the floor in front of her. A car passed outside the window. She raised one hand to cover her mouth, because Nico was sleeping in the other room, and she didn't want him to wake, and she remained there with one hand pressed over her mouth and the other resting on the papers, her shoulders shaking without a sound. She sat for a long time on the tiled floor, directly over the square that was cleaner than everything around it, the place where the oven had stood until that morning. Then she wiped her face with her sleeve and said very softly, almost as though she were asking, "Why didn't you open it, Mama?" No one answered. She folded the 2 sheets carefully along the same old creases the law office had made so many years before, placed them back inside the envelope, then gathered the tin box against her chest and sat there a while longer in the kitchen where the oven was gone. Thalia mailed the letter to that office the following morning, sending it through the post with a single handwritten line asking under whose instructions the original letter had been sent. She addressed it to no one except the name of the law office printed on the envelope. 3 days later, a copy lay on the table before Emmett Sabatini. He read it to the end, then ordered that every record concerning the Halsted district from those years be brought to him. They delivered 2 boxes of documents. He sat with them throughout the afternoon and nearly the entire evening, leaving the overhead lights off and working beneath a single desk lamp, reading each page with the care of a man who knew he was searching for something he didn't want to find. He found it around midnight. It was an order revoking the use of the properties, citing a clause concerning electrical systems that failed to meet fire safety standards, applied to the entire row of buildings on the east side of the street, and scheduled to take effect within 30 days. The man who had carried it out directly, whose name appeared on every report, and who had gone from door to door posting the notices, was Hollis Garrity, the development director of the real estate company controlled by the family. But on the final page, beneath the approval line, was a signature Emmett had recognized since before he knew how to read. His father's signature. He set the document down and remained motionless in the darkness for a very long time. An entire block had closed because of that paper. The Saturday morning market in that neighborhood hadn't died immediately. It lingered for a while before fading away completely, because once the first folding tables disappeared, the shoppers stopped coming, and once the shoppers stopped coming, the tables that remained had no reason to be set up anymore. The next day, he summoned all 4 branches of the family. He spread the records across the center of the table, called Hollis Garrity into the room, and ordered him to read aloud the list of tenants who had lost their places. Garrity had made it through roughly 1/3 of the names when his voice began to falter, and Emmett only told him to keep reading. The entire room sat and listened until the final name had been spoken, and no one moved. After everyone had left, Bruno Cavallo stayed behind to gather the papers. He said this had happened before Emmett had held any authority, that he hadn't given the order, that the signature on the page wasn't his. Emmett said he had never asked either. He said that for all those years, he had signed countless papers other people placed before him, and not once had he ever turned them over to see what others had signed before him. Bruno had no answer. That night, Emmett read through the list once more, alone and more slowly, and this time he read the column of addresses beside every name. He stopped at a line near the bottom of the second page. It concerned a small electrical repair shop owned by a woman, and after her name was a note from a records clerk stating that she had moved away from the city after losing the property, along with the name of the son who had gone with her. Emmett stared at the boy's name for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and woke Bruno in the middle of the night. He told him to undo all of it. Bruno asked what he meant. Emmett said to undo everything they had done to Prescott, call every place back, and make certain that by the end of the week, every door that had been closed was open again exactly as it had been before. Bruno was silent for a beat, then said this had never happened. He said that in all those years, Emmett had never withdrawn an order once it had been given, that people would read too much into it, that the dinner was only days away and this wasn't the time to let anyone read anything into his actions. Emmett said he knew. Then he added, very quietly, that he had just done to that boy exactly what his father had done to the boy's mother, and he ended the call. The row of buildings on Halsted Street had stood abandoned ever since the day the notices were pasted to the doors. No one lived there anymore. The windows had been boarded over, the locks had rusted, and the electrical system remained exactly as it had been, the same system that had been cited as the reason to drive everyone out, and that no one had ever bothered to repair afterward. That night, it shorted out. The fire department was called close to 1 o'clock in the morning, and by the time the engines arrived, smoke had swallowed the entire block, a thick, slow-moving darkness creeping along the face of the street. No one was inside. Not a single person was hurt. The flames climbed to the upper floors and licked across the front of the buildings, bringing down part of the rear roof and shattering windows that had been boarded over for years, but the water reached the ground floor in time. And when morning came, the lowest level was still standing, blackened by smoke but with its walls intact, its floor intact, and even the old kitchen in the back still there. Thalia heard the news before the sky had fully brightened. She took the first train. By the time she arrived, the smoke had faded to gray and rose only in thin waves from the roof, and a barrier had been stretched across the sidewalk. She stood outside it for a while, looking at the charred front of the buildings, looking at the brick wall of the old shoe repair shop, where her mother had set up the folding table every Saturday morning. Then she remembered something. She remembered that when the block had been closed, her mother hadn't brought everything home. She had taken the folding table and the wooden box, but the small wooden sign on which she wrote the prices in chalk had been left hanging in the kitchen at the back of the shop, and she had said to leave it there, because they would collect it when the place reopened the following week. That following week never came. Thalia slipped beneath the barrier. Someone called after her, but she had already gone through the rear entrance. Inside, it was dark, wet, and heavy with the smell of smoke, water dripping steadily from the ceiling onto the floor. She moved along the wall, feeling her way through the darkness, and found it exactly where it had always been, hanging from a nail behind the pantry door, a piece of wood about the size of 2 hands, its surface stained with smoke, but the chalk marks still visible, the crooked, oversized letters of someone who wrote English by remembering the shapes of words rather than by learning how to spell them. She lifted it from the nail and held it against her chest. When she turned to leave, a hand caught her by the elbow and pulled her toward the door. Emmett Sabatini said nothing until they were both safely out on the sidewalk beyond the barrier. Then he released her and asked whether she understood that the building could have collapsed. Thalia said she did. She added that this was the last trace of her mother's handwriting left in the world, and that was the only sentence she spoke. Emmett looked at the wooden sign in her hands. He didn't reproach her again. The two of them stood there as the day began to break, watching the firefighters roll up their hoses and the blackened facade release its final threads of smoke. Then Emmett said no one had set the place on fire. He said the wiring had already been old on the day it was used as the excuse to force everyone out, and in all the years since, not one person had returned to replace it. He said they had locked the doors and walked away, nothing more, and no one had been cruel to this place in the years that followed. They had simply stopped remembering it. Then he said fire was never what killed a neighborhood. Fire only came at the end, after everything had been left dry for long enough. Bruno Cavallo stood several steps away with a telephone in his hand, waiting. Emmett turned toward him. He said that beginning that night, someone was to stand guard there. Bruno asked for how long. Emmett said all night, every night, until the place had been rebuilt. Bruno asked what he meant by rebuilt, and Emmett said he didn't know yet, but they could decide that later. For now, beginning that very night, the place wasn't to be left empty for even one more night. When he finished speaking, he turned back toward Thalia. She was still holding the wooden sign against her chest, both hands gripping its edges, and she was looking at the stretch of sidewalk before the brick wall, the empty space where nothing stood anymore. The following afternoon, Connie Whitlow knocked on the door of the apartment above the laundromat. She hadn't called ahead. She carried a cloth bag, and inside it was an old videotape in a yellowed plastic case, along with a player she said she had borrowed from her grandson. She told Thalia she had meant to bring it over ever since that night at Verdun, then changed her mind, and when she heard that the block had burned, she thought that if she waited any longer, she would never bring it at all. The two women connected the cables to the old television in the corner. The picture appeared blurred and unsteady. A local news report about the immigrant market on Halsted Street, filmed many years earlier, the reporter's voice sounding as though it were traveling through a pipe. The camera passed several stalls before stopping at a folding table set against a brick wall. A woman stood at each end of the table. Between them lay a sheet of dough. 4 hands stretched and folded it together, moving in opposite directions before meeting again in the center, so perfectly synchronized that they looked like one person with 4 hands. They worked while talking, one woman speaking in one language, the other answering in another, and both of them laughing. Thalia rose from her chair without realizing she had done it. She moved close to the screen, crouched in front of it, and watched the passage 3 times. 4 hands. All her life, she had stretched that dough with 2 hands, and all her life, she had believed she was clumsy. She remembered the stool, remembered her mother's arms slipping past her shoulders, remembered the larger hands resting over the smaller ones, and she understood that through all those years, her mother had never been teaching her to do it alone. She had been standing in the place of the second person. Thalia asked who the other woman was. Connie didn't answer immediately. She pressed the pause button, freezing the image on the face of the woman standing at the far end of the table. Then she said the woman's name was Assunta. Her last name was Sabatini. Thalia couldn't speak. Connie continued, saying that in those days she cleaned several of the stores in that neighborhood and was there every morning, so she had seen everything. She said Assunta's own family had forbidden her from going near that market. Forbidden it fiercely, because they believed a woman carrying that name had no business selling bread on a sidewalk beside a stranger. Then she said Assunta went anyway. Every Saturday morning, she went before sunrise and returned before the household had time to wake, and she continued doing it for years, until she could no longer manage the journey. Connie sat quietly for a while. Then she pointed toward the screen, toward the tray of bread beside the women, and asked whether Thalia knew what the 3 cuts across the top were meant to represent. Thalia said her mother had told her they were there so the bread could breathe. Connie shook her head. She said the 3 cuts were 3 children. Over the years, those 2 women had fed 3 children Saturday breakfast at that table. Not all at once, because one would grow older and another would take that place. But the 3 cuts never changed, not even during the seasons when only one child remained. The room was silent for a long time after that. Then Connie placed both hands on her knees and said there was one more thing, something she had carried inside herself ever since those days. She said the wiring in that row of buildings had been terribly dangerous, with bare wires exposed behind wooden panels, and once a section of wall had been scorched, yet no one had done anything. She said she had been afraid someone would burn to death in there, so she reported it. She called the city, gave them her name, told them exactly where the damage was, and went home that night and slept peacefully because she believed she had saved someone's life. Then she raised her eyes to Thalia and said that several months later, they used that very telephone call as the excuse to close the entire block. That night, Thalia couldn't sleep. She lay awake thinking about the 2 pairs of hands on the screen. Then her thoughts turned to something else, something far smaller, yet something that had remained lodged inside her for weeks like a splinter. She sat up, switched on the light, and opened the photograph that an old acquaintance from Verdun had captured from a screen and sent her on the day the file began circulating. She didn't open it because of Emmett. He had his own people. He had 2 entire boxes of records, and he didn't need her. She opened it because the photograph showed her right forearm. That scar was the most private thing she possessed, something she had learned to conceal with the practiced motion of pulling down her sleeve without looking, and someone had stood behind her in the darkness, raised a telephone, and photographed it. She wanted to know who that person was. She enlarged the image. She studied the angle from which it had been taken, the direction of the shadows, and the bulb hanging above the vegetable sink. Then she looked behind herself in the picture, toward the hidden corner at the right edge of the frame, where a tray covered with a damp cloth sat on a steel table, and she became completely still. The dough inside that tray had risen and spilled over the rim in a way only a baker would know how to read. It wasn't dough that had just been set to rise. It wasn't dough that had finished rising either. It was somewhere in the middle of its second rise, a brief and delicate stage she knew better than she knew her own face in the mirror. Because for 5 years she had watched for it night after night. She set the dough down just as the lights over the outer row were switched off. By the time it reached that stage, the clock had already passed midnight, and it remained there only for a very narrow span before beginning to collapse. The photograph had been taken during that span. Thalia sat on the edge of the bed and counted backward in her mind. Only 3 people had remained in the kitchen that night. Nolan Prescott had already left. She remembered it clearly because he had kicked the trash can at the end of the aisle on his way out, and she had looked up. Gideon Thackeray had never stayed past 10 o'clock, not once in 5 years. The third person was the man who entered through the back door with Emmett every night, the man who stood at the end of the corridor and waited while Emmett sat in the plastic chair beside the vegetable sink. The next morning, she called him. She said she needed to meet with him, and she said she wanted the others to be there as well. They met in the room on the upper floor, the room where no one sat with his back to the door. Thalia stood at the head of the table with her telephone in her hand. She said she knew nothing about their business. She said she didn't understand what they did with one another, who owed whom, or who was permitted to sit where. Then she said she did know exactly how far her dough had risen at every hour of the night, and she placed the telephone on the wooden table, turned the screen toward them, and explained precisely what stage the dough in the photograph had reached when the picture was taken. When she finished, she fell silent. No one in the room moved. Bruno Cavallo sat 2 places from the head of the table. He didn't look at the telephone. He looked at Emmett. Then he placed both hands flat on the wooden table, and he didn't deny a single word. Emmett didn't ask why. He didn't ask who had paid him, how long it had been happening, or what else there might be. He only looked at the man who had walked beside him since the years before anyone had called either of them sir, and he looked at him for a very long time. Then he said that from that day forward, Bruno was free. He said no one was to touch him. He said no one was to go looking for him. No one was to trouble his wife or his children, and anyone who disobeyed would answer to him. Then he added one final sentence, still in the same voice someone might use to announce a train's departure time, that from now on, no one in the city would answer Bruno's calls either. The entire room seemed to turn cold. Bruno Cavallo stood, pushed his chair neatly back against the table, and walked out. No one went with him. The dinner wasn't held at Verdun. Emmett had the ground floor of the fire-damaged building on Halsted Street cleared out, and the work took 3 days. They shoveled away the ashes, scraped soot from the walls, ran a temporary electrical line in from the pole outside, hung several bulbs from the ceiling, then placed a single long wooden table through the center of the room, over a tiled floor that remained stained gray no matter how many times it was scrubbed. There was no tablecloth. There were no flowers. Above them, where the ceiling had been burned through, a tarpaulin had been stretched across the opening. Ignazio Sabatini arrived before the appointed time. He stood in the doorway, looking inside, looking at the bare wooden table and the blackened walls, then asked whether Emmett intended to make the entire family sit down to eat in a pile of ashes. Emmett said his uncle was standing in the place where his own mother had sat every Saturday morning for all those years. Then he added that Ignazio had never known, and neither had he until the week before. Ignazio didn't answer. He stepped inside, walked slowly around the room, and asked no more questions. In the back, the old kitchen had been scrubbed, and the water reconnected. Thalia arrived early that morning to inspect the space where she would work and the preparation table. She crossed the kitchen threshold, then stopped. In the corner, against the inner wall, stood her mother's oven. She recognized it immediately from the dent along the edge of the door, the mark Nico had made years earlier when he was still learning to walk. She approached it and placed one hand against its side. Then she reached for the handle and lifted it the way she always had, raising it slightly so it would catch properly. But it was no longer loose. It fitted firmly into place. She opened the door and closed it, opened it and closed it again, and every time it held perfectly. And she stood there for quite a while with her hand still resting on the handle. She thought Emmett had done it. She had meant to tell him that he hadn't needed to, that she would repay him even though she had no idea how. But when he passed the kitchen doorway and she asked him, he looked at the oven, then at her, and said it hadn't been him. He said he had only seen it there for the first time that morning. Thalia turned toward the entrance. Gideon Thackeray was standing just beyond the threshold, holding a small toolbox. He didn't step inside. She looked at him, at the box in his hand, at his sleeves rolled above his forearms, and at the black machine grease on the back of his right hand that he hadn't managed to wash away completely. She didn't ask where he had gone, whom he had questioned, how many days it had taken him to trace the company that bought used kitchen equipment, or how much he had paid to bring the oven back. She never asked him later either. Gideon never told her. He simply stood there and asked whether he was allowed to enter the kitchen. Thalia was silent for a moment. Then she said yes, but she told him that today he would wash the vegetables. Gideon Thackeray nodded. He placed the toolbox on the doorstep, walked inside, went directly to the sink in the farthest corner, rolled his sleeves up another turn, and opened the faucet. He washed vegetables all that day. He washed them one bundle at a time, soaking them, shaking off the water, placing them into baskets, then reaching for another bundle, and he performed the task with the same precision he had once carried through his own kitchen, while walking the line with both hands clasped behind his back. No one in that kitchen spoke to him about what had happened. No one called him chef. When someone needed a basket of vegetables, they said, "Please pass me that basket." And he handed it over. And they said thank you. And he nodded. By afternoon, both his hands had reddened from the cold water, and he was still standing there with his back to the entire kitchen, in the most hidden corner of the room. By late afternoon, the dough had finished rising. Thalia dusted a thin layer of flour over the long wooden table in the center of the kitchen, placed the dough upon it, laid her palm over the surface, and held it still the way her mother always had. Outside, she could already hear cars pulling up along the street, doors closing, and people entering the room beyond the kitchen. She remained there a little longer than usual. Then she lifted her hand and said she needed one more person. The entire kitchen fell silent. The young assistant carrying a basket stopped in the middle of the aisle. In the farthest corner, Gideon Thackeray turned off the faucet, and in the silence, the only sound left was the final drop of water falling into the sink. No one stepped forward. It wasn't because they didn't want to, but because no one in that kitchen knew what to do with his own two hands if he did. Then footsteps sounded at the doorway. Emmett Sabatini entered, paused for a moment as he looked at the wooden table, then removed his coat and draped it over the back of a chair. He unfastened his cufflinks, rolled his right sleeve above the elbow, then rolled up the left. Along both forearms were old burn scars, none of them large, scattered in small patches across the inner skin. The kind of scars that had faded with the years but would never disappear completely. The kind a person carried only after spending his earliest years wandering too close to an oven. He said nothing about them. He simply walked around to the opposite end of the table, stood facing her, and placed both hands on the dough. Thalia saw them. She didn't ask. She only told him to let his hands follow hers, not to push, not to press down. And whenever she pulled toward herself, he was to fold the dough back toward him. Emmett nodded. They began. At first, their rhythm was uneven, the two sides moving at different speeds, and the dough gathered toward one end. She told him to slow down. He slowed down. By the third attempt, they found the rhythm. 4 hands moved in opposite directions and met again in the center, stretching outward, folding inward, stretching outward, folding inward, and the sheet of dough began to widen evenly from its center toward all 4 sides in a way she had never seen during all those 5 years. It grew thinner. It reached the place where it had always torn before. Thalia held her breath. It didn't tear. It became thinner still, so thin that the light hanging from the ceiling shone clearly through it, and she could see the shadows of 4 hands on the other side of the dough, her 2 hands and his, moving together across the same surface. She pulled it through one final stretch. Then she stopped. The entire sheet lay before them, evenly drawn, perfectly intact, without a single split. No one in the kitchen spoke. Thalia released the dough and stepped back half a pace, and for those few seconds, she didn't look at it. She looked at her own 2 hands. Then she picked up the knife, scored 3 evenly spaced lines across the bread, not 2, not 4, and placed it in the oven. The bread was carried out after every light in the large room had been switched on. The 4 branches of the family sat along the long wooden table. 40 people dressed in expensive clothes, seated between 4 smoke-blackened walls, and they had been sitting there for some time, without exchanging more than a few polite words. A plate was placed before each person. The 3 cuts across the bread were still releasing steam. Ignazio Sabatini was the first to eat. He cut off a piece, raised it to his mouth, and chewed. Then he cut a second piece. Halfway through it, he stopped. He set his fork against the edge of the plate very gently, without making a sound, and said nothing. He sat with his back straight, staring down at the wooden table before him, his old hands resting on either side of the plate, and he remained that way. The person beside him looked over. Then that person ate as well, and also set down his fork. It traveled along the length of the table in a way no one could control, from one end to the other, one person at a time, until gradually there was no longer any sound of knives or forks in the room. No one offered praise. No one turned to ask the person beside him what he thought. 40 people sat in silence inside a half-burned building, and that silence lasted almost a full minute. A silence the 4 branches of this family had never once shared throughout all the years they had sat together at other tables, grander tables, cleaner tables, in places with tablecloths and flowers. At the kitchen doorway, Thalia leaned against the frame with flowers still clinging to her hands and watched. Behind her, in the farthest corner, Gideon Thackeray had turned off the faucet long before and was watching too, his hands reddened by the cold water and hanging loosely at his sides. Neither of them said anything. At the head of the table, Ignacio raised one hand and wiped quickly across his face, then lowered it again, and still he didn't speak. When the plates had been cleared and people began taking documents from their briefcases, Emmett Sabatini rose to his feet. He said he wouldn't sign anything until everyone at that table had heard a story. Then he told it. He told them about the order revoking the leases, about the fire safety clause used to justify it, about how the entire block had been locked within 30 days, and how the Saturday morning market had died with it. He spoke Hollis Garrity's name. Then he spoke the name written beneath the approval line, and he said it slowly and clearly, swallowing not a single syllable, the name of his own father, before 40 people who carried that same family name inside the building that very document had abandoned to rot. He said he hadn't known about it until the previous week. Then he added that ignorance wasn't an excuse either, because for all those years, he had signed countless papers placed before him, without ever once turning them over to see what lay behind them. The room went still. Then a man seated near the middle of the table stood, closed the folder before him, and said he needed more time to think. At the far end, 2 others rose as well. No one raised his voice. No one offered a single word of criticism. They simply folded their papers, slipped their pens into their jacket pockets, and 3 of the family's 4 branches left that long wooden table without signing. Emmett remained standing. He had known this would happen from the moment he pushed back his chair, and he had spoken anyway. Ignacio Sabatini didn't rise. He stayed where he was, his old hands resting on either side of the place where his plate had been, and waited until the footsteps beyond the door had faded completely. Then he told Emmett to sit down. He said he didn't agree with him. He said he never had. And tonight he agreed with him even less. Then he said that in 40 years of sitting at tables like this one, he had never seen anyone in this family dare to speak before everyone the name of someone he loved, and he said he would sign. Emmett didn't answer immediately. Ignacio drew the papers closer and uncapped his pen, then stopped and added one more condition. He said this block would be rebuilt, but not with the family's money. He said Emmett had chosen to speak, so Emmett would pay for it himself, from his own share down to the final dollar. And when that money was gone, it was gone. Emmett said yes. Then he sat, and Ignacio signed. At the far end of the room, near the exit, a man rose to his feet. Nolan Prescott hadn't been invited. He had stood outside on the sidewalk from the moment the bread was carried in, then entered through the side door and remained near the wall all this time. Now he stepped into the center aisle, and everyone left in the room turned to look at him. He spoke his birth name. Then he spoke his mother's name, and said it appeared on the second page of the list Emmett had read earlier. He said his mother had owned a small electrical repair shop 3 doors down from that brick wall, that after losing the property, the 2 of them had moved away from the city, and that she later remarried, and he took his stepfather's surname, because it was the quickest way to stop people from asking where he had come from. He said that for all those years, he had studied, worked, and climbed upward by doing one thing, burying the place he had come from as deeply as he could. Then he turned toward the kitchen doorway, where Thalia was standing. He said that when he was a boy, he had been fed at that folding table every Saturday morning. He said he still remembered the 3 cuts across the bread. He said that back then, he had believed they meant there were 3 pieces, and he had always been given the one in the middle. No one in the room spoke. Then his voice changed. He told Thalia not to imagine that anyone was honoring her tonight. He said this family had closed an entire block, allowed it to decay for years, and now they were sitting in the ashes they had created, eating her mother's bread, preparing to rise from the table, feeling as though they had finally paid their debt. He said they weren't honoring her. They were using her to wipe their hands clean. The words fell into the room, and no one reached down to pick them up. Thalia stepped away from the kitchen doorway. She walked toward him, stopped several paces away, and looked at him for a long time. She didn't mention the photograph. She didn't mention the file, the day she had been forced to remove her apron and place it on the corner of Gideon's desk, or the appointment for her brother that had been postponed until the following quarter. She only asked him what he had been so afraid of losing that he had needed to do what he did. Nolan Prescott opened his mouth. Then no words came. He stood in the middle of that room with 40 people watching him, and the answer he had repeated to himself through so many nights, the answer about protecting 2 stars and protecting other people's jobs, couldn't leave his mouth when he finally needed it. He remained there for a very long time. Then he lowered his head and said nothing. When Nolan had stepped back into the darkness beside the door and no one was looking at him anymore, Emmett turned to Thalia. He said the family was opening a restaurant on the north side of the city, a legitimate business with every license and document in order, and he wanted her to be its head chef. He said she would choose her own staff, write her own menu, and no one would ever be permitted to ask where she had studied. He named the salary, and several people seated along the long wooden table lifted their heads slightly. Thalia remained still for a moment. Then she thanked him. Then she said no. She said that if she accepted tonight, the story would end in exactly the way people always told such stories, with a poor young woman and a wealthy man who stepped in to save her, and everyone who heard it would feel warm inside and go peacefully to sleep. She said she didn't want it to end that way. She wanted it to end with this neighborhood learning to stand on its own again. She said her mother hadn't needed anyone to save her. Her mother had only needed a place to set down her folding table. Then she asked for one thing, the only thing she requested that entire evening. She asked them not to put her name on anything here. Many months later, the bakery reopened. It stood in the same place as before, beside the brick wall of the old shoe repair shop, and it opened only on Saturday mornings. Next door was a shared kitchen, available to anyone in the neighborhood who wanted to prepare food to take away and sell. And above the kitchen door were 2 names, the names of the 2 women who had once stood at opposite ends of a table. The entire block was rebuilt one building at a time, slowly, because money was limited, and the people who returned were the children and grandchildren of those who had once been driven away. The bakery had only one rule, written in chalk on the wooden sign hanging behind the counter. Every batch of dough made there had to be stretched by 2 people. No one was allowed to work alone. Anyone who came to learn without a second person had to go out and find one. Verdun sent apprentices there every month, and the first lesson they were taught wasn't technique. It was to taste first and ask about someone's history afterward. The money from the bread was enough for Thalia to finish paying for her brother's procedure, and then enough for her to take the paper from the bottom of the drawer and have surgery on her own hand. On the first Saturday morning after her bandages came off, a line had already formed outside the bakery before the sky was fully light. Ignazio Sabatini stood among them, quietly waiting like everyone else. Gideon Thackeray had arrived earlier than anyone, holding an empty basket in his hands, and near the end of the line, speaking to no one, stood Nolan Prescott. Inside, Nico saw the oven light turn off for the first time in his life, and the boy turned toward his sister and burst into laughter. Emmett still came every Saturday morning. He didn't sit in one of the customer chairs. He hung his coat on a hook, rolled both sleeves above his elbows, then walked around to take his place at the opposite end of the table, and together they began to stretch the dough. People are accustomed to asking where we studied, before asking what we can do. They are accustomed to looking at the scar on our hand before looking at what that hand has created. But the finest things in life have never been the most expensive. They are the things someone made beside us. There are hands extended toward us that we're too proud to take, and there are envelopes we leave unopened inside a box for an entire lifetime. And sometimes the price of doing that is far greater than we ever imagined. So if you've spent years believing that you can never quite succeed, perhaps you aren't clumsy at all. Perhaps you've simply been standing alone in work that was always meant for 2 pairs of hands. If today's story touched you, please leave a comment below, because we truly want to hear what lies deep within your heart. We want to know what you think about Thalia, about the man who rolled up his sleeves and took his place at the opposite end of the table, and about the 2 women who once stretched a sheet of dough together on Halsted Street. Share this story with someone who has been looked down upon for far too long, because today may be the day they desperately need to hear it. And please subscribe to the channel and press the like button so that more warm stories like this can find their way to you each day. We wish every one of you listening lasting good health, peaceful and joyful days, and a gentle life beside the people you love. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next story.